November 8, 1944. 26,000 feet above the dense pine forests of the Ardennes, where autumn fog clung to valleys and the November cold turned exhaled breath to frost on instrument panels. Lieutenant Marcus Hendricks, United States Army Air Forces, adjusted the trim on his P-38 Lightning and felt both engines thrumming in perfect synchronization, the twin-boom fighter responding with the precision of a surgical instrument. Below him, through breaks in the cloud layer, the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg stretched toward horizons already shadowed by early winter twilight. He had been separated from his squadron during a running engagement with German fighters 15 minutes earlier, a moment of confusion in swirling clouds that left him alone with dwindling fuel and a long flight back to base in France. Standard procedure dictated maintaining altitude, setting course for home, monitoring fuel consumption with disciplined precision. But the German voices filling his headset suggested his solitary journey would not be uneventful. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, climbing from multiple directions, their pilots speaking in the clipped professional tones of veterans coordinating an intercept. They had spotted him. They were positioning for attack. And they believed they had trapped a lone American fighter with nowhere to run. Hendricks did not increase speed. He did not change altitude. His hands remained steady on the controls as he monitored the German transmissions, understanding enough to track their positions, their attack vectors, their growing confidence. The P-38 Lightning was an unusual aircraft, twin-engined, twin-boomed, distinctly recognizable, possessing capabilities that conventional single-engine fighters could not match, but also limitations that experienced opponents knew how to exploit. The German pilots climbing toward him were experienced. They knew the Lightning could be deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot, but they also knew it was less maneuverable than their Bf-109s in turning combat, that catching it in a sustained dogfight could negate its advantages. 12 against 1. The arithmetic was overwhelming. What they did not know was that the lone American they were hunting had spent 18 months flying combat missions in every theater from North Africa to France, had accumulated knowledge about his aircraft's performance envelope that transcended what any manual could teach, and had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the one advantage the P-38 possessed that no German fighter could match: the ability to disappear. By November 1944, the air war over Western Europe had entered a grinding phase of attrition where German fighter forces, though diminished, remained dangerous when properly coordinated. The Luftwaffe that had dominated European skies in 1940 no longer existed in its previous form, but what remained were highly skilled veterans flying against increasingly long odds, conserving fuel and aircraft for moments when tactical advantage might be gained. The Bf-109, backbone of German fighter forces throughout the war, remained a formidable opponent, fast, maneuverable, well-armed, deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. When 12 of them converged on a single American fighter, the outcome should have been predetermined. The P-38 Lightning that Hendricks flew represented American aviation engineering's answer to long-range fighter requirements that European designs could not adequately address. With two Allison V-1710 engines mounted in twin booms and a central nacelle housing the pilot and armament, it possessed range exceeding 300 miles, speed approaching 400 miles per hour, and concentrated firepower of 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon. But its most unusual characteristic, the feature that made it unlike any other fighter in American service, was its turbo superchargers. These complex devices, mounted in the rear of each engine boom, allowed the Lightning to maintain engine power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. At 26,000 feet, where the thin atmosphere robbed conventional engines of performance, the P-38's turbocharged engines still produced full power. This advantage had made it the aircraft of choice for long-range escort missions and high-altitude intercepts throughout the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. But turbochargers were complex, temperamental, prone to failure if mishandled. They required careful management, precise throttle control, constant monitoring. And they created a distinctive visual signature: exhaust flames from the turbocharger wastegates, visible at certain power settings, that could betray an aircraft's position to observant enemies. German pilots had learned to watch for these flames, to use them as targeting references. The 12 Bf-109s climbing toward Hendricks that afternoon knew what to look for. The German formation leader's voice crackled over the radio, confident and professional. Target confirmed. Single lightning at Angels 2-6. Execute standard intercept. The 12 fighters split into 3 elements of 4, a classic Luftwaffe tactic designed to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, preventing the target from focusing defensive attention in any single direction. 4 would approach from above and ahead, forcing the American to turn or dive. 4 would position themselves on the flanks, ready to cut off lateral escape. 4 would maintain position below and behind, prepared to intercept any dive attempt. It was textbook execution, a maneuver these pilots had practiced countless times, refined through combat experience into a killing technique that rarely failed. Hendricks watched them come, tracking their positions through a combination of visual observation and radio intercepts. He calculated angles, distances, closure rates with the calm precision of someone who had done this mathematics so many times it had become instinctive. And then, as the German fighters closed to within 3 miles, he did something that should have been tactically suicidal. He reduced power on both engines to idle, extended his dive brakes, and pitched the P-38's nose down into a gentle descent that bled airspeed rapidly. Within 30 seconds, his airspeed had dropped from 320 miles per hour to under 80. The Lightning, robbed of speed, wallowed through the thin air like a transport rather than a fighter. And the turbocharger exhaust flames, those distinctive signatures that German pilots used for visual acquisition, disappeared completely as engine power dropped to minimum output. The German radio chatter changed instantly. Confusion replaced confidence. "Where is he? I have lost visual contact. Last position Angels 2-6, Sector 4. Confirm position." The formation leader's voice cut through the confusion, sharp with frustration. "All elements, maintain position. He must be there. Continue search." But the P-38 was not where they expected it to be. Hendricks had dropped 2,000 feet in the time it took the German fighters to close the distance, and without his exhaust flames to mark his position, without his speed to create a distinctive contrail, the Lightning had effectively vanished against the backdrop of darkening clouds and forested terrain below. The symbolic object that defined this engagement was neither weapon nor instrument, but something more ephemeral: the exhaust flame itself. Throughout the war, the P-38's turbocharger flames had been both blessing and curse. They provided the power that made the Lightning effective at high altitude, but they also betrayed its position to enemies who knew what to look for. Hendricks had turned this vulnerability into a weapon by simply extinguishing it, by reducing power to the point where the flames disappeared and the aircraft became a ghost in the gathering twilight. The flame represented American technological complexity, the sophisticated engineering that gave American fighters capabilities their enemies could not match, but also the potential for that complexity to become a liability if not properly managed. For 8 minutes, 12 German fighters searched the sky for a target that had simply disappeared. They flew search patterns, they called out positions, they maintained formation discipline, and executed their procedures exactly as trained. But procedures are predicated on assumptions, and the fundamental assumption, that a P-38 at 26,000 feet would maintain speed and altitude when threatened, had been violated. Hendricks had descended to 16,000 feet, had reduced his speed to barely above stalling, had allowed his aircraft to become sluggish and vulnerable in exchange for invisibility. And in the darkening November sky, invisibility was survival. The German formation leader's transmissions grew increasingly frustrated. "Expand search radius. He cannot have gone far." But fuel gauges were dropping, the sun was setting, and the longer they searched without contact, the more their tactical advantage evaporated. At 12 minutes into the engagement, a new voice entered the radio traffic, younger, tinged with something approaching panic. "He's a dead ghost. We've lost him." The phrase, captured by American radio intelligence and translated after the war, encapsulated the psychological impact of the failed intercept. The Germans had not been outfought or outmaneuvered in any conventional sense. Their target had simply ceased to exist as far as they could determine, had become a dead ghost, something that should be there but was not. something that defied their understanding of how aerial combat was supposed to work. At 15 minutes, the German formation leader made the decision tactical reality demanded. All elements, break off search. Return to base. 12 fighters turned east, toward Germany and their bases, having burned precious fuel in a pursuit that achieved nothing except the demonstration of their inability to adapt. When an opponent refused to follow expected patterns, their radios fell silent. The professional chatter replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of failure. Hendricks waited 5 minutes after the German fighters departed before advancing his throttles and beginning his climb back to altitude. The P-38 responded sluggishly at first, the engines taking time to spool up from idle. But gradually speed returned, and with it, the aircraft's normal handling characteristics. He set course for his base in France, monitoring fuel carefully, and landed 40 minutes later with tanks nearly empty, but aircraft undamaged. His after-action report was characteristically brief. Evaded 12 enemy fighters through altitude and speed reduction. No shots fired, no damage sustained. The intelligence officers who debriefed him noted the tactic with interest, using the P-38's turbocharged engines in reverse, exploiting their ability to operate at low power settings to eliminate visual signatures rather than exploiting their high-altitude performance. What the German pilots expected that afternoon was a conventional intercept of a lone enemy fighter attempting to escape through speed and maneuver. What they experienced was an opponent who understood that sometimes survival meant becoming slow rather than fast, visible rather than invisible, that the rules of aerial combat were guidelines rather than absolutes, and that technological complexity could be turned against itself to create tactical advantages that doctrine did not anticipate. The engagement lasted 15 minutes and achieved nothing except the preservation of one American pilot and the consumption of German fuel that could not be replaced. The transformation this incident represented was subtle but significant. American fighter tactics in 1944 emphasized aggression, speed, firepower, using technological and numerical advantages to overwhelm opponents through violent action. Hendricks had demonstrated that sometimes the opposite approach worked better, that reducing power and disappearing could be more effective than accelerating and fighting. His tactic could not be taught in flight school because it required intimate knowledge of aircraft systems, precise understanding of enemy capabilities, and the psychological security to make oneself temporarily vulnerable in exchange for long-term survival. It was improvisation born of experience, the kind of tactical innovation that democratic militaries encouraged through training that valued individual initiative over rigid adherence to doctrine. The German pilots who returned to base that evening discussed the failed intercept in quiet voices, trying to understand how 12 fighters had lost a single target in clear conditions. They filed reports noting that American pilots were demonstrating increasingly sophisticated evasion techniques, that straightforward tactical approaches were proving insufficient, that every engagement now carried the possibility of unexpected complications. These reports joined thousands of others documenting the gradual erosion of Luftwaffe effectiveness, the accumulated evidence that German forces were fighting an enemy who could adapt faster, innovate more effectively, and bring resources to bear that made numerical and tactical advantages irrelevant. The exhaust flame that Hendricks had extinguished to disappear from enemy view represented more than a technical feature of turbocharged engines. It represented the light of American industrial and technological power, the flame of innovation and production that burned so brightly it could be seen across oceans and continents. When that flame was visible, it illuminated American strength. The factories, the resources, the engineering sophistication that enemies could not match. But it could also be controlled, directed, even extinguished temporarily when tactical circumstances required invisibility rather than display. The flexibility to use power or withhold it, to fight aggressively or evade cleverly, to adapt tactics to situations rather than forcing situations to conform to tactics. This flexibility was the advantage that democratic systems possessed over authoritarian ones, the edge that made American forces increasingly effective as the war progressed. In the end, the dead ghost that panicked German radios over the Ardennes was not supernatural but entirely rational, the product of training, experience, and technological understanding applied creatively under pressure. Hendricks had not defied the laws of physics or performed impossible maneuvers. He had simply recognized that his aircraft's most distinctive feature could be turned off. That invisibility was sometimes more valuable than speed, that surviving to fight another day required thinking beyond the tactical frameworks that both sides had used throughout the war. The German fighters that searched unsuccessfully for 15 minutes had been defeated not by superior force but by superior adaptation, by an opponent who understood that winning sometimes meant disappearing rather than fighting, that the best victory was the one that required no shots fired and left everyone alive to recognize that the rules had changed and would continue changing until one side could no longer keep up.